Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. David Hume's essay, The Epicurean, has an interesting subtitle that he gives in a footnote, or the man of elegance and pleasure. And he tells us, because there's 4 essays in a row, the intention of this and the 3 following essays is not so much to explain accurately the sentiments of the ancient sects of philosophy as to deliver these sentiments of sects that naturally form themselves in the world and entertain different ideas of human life and happiness. I have given each of them the name of the philosophical sect to which it bears the greatest affinity. So that tells us that Hume is not engaging in an academic exposition of Epicurean philosophy. He's just saying that there's a kind of attitude towards life, a way of living out, thinking about regulating one's life, prioritizing, that is closer to the Epicureans than, say, to the Stoics or the Platonists or the skeptics, who he will talk about in other essays. And he's going to begin this by saying that we cannot surpass nature. It's a great mortification to the vanity of man that his utmost art and industry can never equal the meanest of nature's production, either for beauty or for value. And so he tells us that art is only the underworkman, but nature must produce a human being. He goes on and he says, even in those productions, commonly denominated works of art, we find that the noblest of the kind are beholden for their chief beauty to the force and happy influence of nature. So, for example, with poets, the poets are reproducing in verse what it is that they're seeing out there in, say, the natural landscape. And he says the greatest genius, where nature fails him, throws aside the lyre and hopes not from the rules of art to reach that divine harmony which must proceed from her inspiration alone. So, basic idea there, the natural world, we can modify it, we can understand it, we can reproduce it, but we really can't get beyond it as far as its beauty, its capacity to give us pleasure. And then he talks about the mistake of seeking for what he calls an artificial happiness. So a happiness that would be produced by some sort of guidelines or rules of art. And he says that we can't be pleased by rules of reason and by reflection. He talks about this interesting example of Xerxes, the Persian king, having a contest. Who could produce a new pleasure? Now that's worth actually thinking about. Maybe we do have some new pleasures or new objects of pleasure in the present that weren't there during David Hume's time. For example, the pleasure of lying in bed with your tablet or phone or the TV across the room, endlessly binge watching your favorite show, right? We say, well, that wasn't available back then. Well, you're right about that. But you haven't really invented anything fundamentally new. You've just modified circumstances. They had plays back then. You just had to have actors putting them on. It's not like they didn't have beds to lie in. And so he goes on and he says that there isn't really any way to produce fundamentally new pleasures. And then he says, you pretend to make me happy by reason and by rules of art. Well, then you have to recreate me as a human being by rules of art. On my original frame and structure does my happiness depend, our human nature, right? So unless you're going to modify human beings to take pleasure in things that they didn't take pleasure in prior, it's not going to be successful. And he goes on and he says, to what purpose should I pretend to regulate, refine, or invigorate any of those springs or principles which nature has implanted in me? Is this the road by which I must reach happiness? And then he says, no, why not? Well, because happiness implies ease, contentment, repose, and pleasure, not watchfulness, care, and fatigue, right? And he talks about what his body does. The stomach digests aliments, the heart circulates the blood, the brain separates and refines the spirits. I don't have to be concerned about any of this in the matter when by my will alone I can stop the blood as it runs with impetuosity along its canals. Then may I hope to change the course of my sentiments and passions, he goes on. He says, if I do this sort of thing, all I'm going to give myself is pain, not actual pleasure. So enough with the rules and reasonings and all of that. What about seeking happiness within ourselves? He says, oh, that's a loser proposition as well. He says, if we feast on our own thoughts, satisfied with the consciousness of well-doing, despising all assistance and all supplies from external objects, that's not actually the voice of nature. That's actually the voice of pride. And he says, even if this pride could support itself and communicate a real inward pleasure, which he doesn't think it can, the way he describes it is melancholy, right? And he says, this impotent pride can no more than regulate the outside and with infinite pains and attention compose the language and countenance to a philosophical dignity in order to deceive the innocent vulgar. So what does he mean? People who follow that course, they're perhaps fooling themselves and at best fooling other people. They're not really happy. He goes on and he says, the heart, meanwhile, is empty of all enjoyment. The mind, unsupported of proper objects, sinks into deepest sorrow and dejection. And he talks about there being an immense void. So that's not a way to get pleasure. That's not a way to have a good time. So he says, don't confine me in myself, but instead point out to me objects and pleasures which afford me the great or chief enjoyment. And so he says, I'm not going to listen to you, proud and ignorant sages, about the road to happiness. If I actually do want happiness, what do I need to do? Consult my own passions, that is, emotions and desires and drives, and inclinations. In them, I must read the dictates of nature, not in your frivolous discourses. And so what do we find out if we do that? Well, pleasure is the supreme love, the thing that is desired the most by human beings, but even by the gods as well. And pleasure advances towards me, and I don't even have to think about it. As pleasure approaches, I enjoy it. Right? I take a sip of a good beer, wine, or something like that. Oh, I like the taste. And there's the intoxication. I walk out into a early summer garden and smell the irises and the lilac and see the beautiful colors and the bees flitting around and perhaps even a butterfly. I just enjoy it. I don't have to think about it, right? And so he goes on and he says that, every faculty is dissolved in joy while she pours about me the embellishments of the spring and the treasures of the autumn. So this is sensual pleasure, right? Now, what happens, assuming we enjoy this pleasure, because he talks about the possibility of chance taking it away, what happens when we've had enough? Well, it doesn't have the same effect. You could think of all the different pleasures in your life. Do you ever get sick of them? Do you ever get sated, satisfied, and then they're never quite what they used to be? He says, the roses have lost their hue, the fruit its flavor. That delicious wine now solicits in vain the sated palate. Pleasure smiles at my languor. What does pleasure do? She beckons to her sister, virtue, who now shows up. Virtue observes the call and brings along the whole troop of my jovial friends, and by following virtue, remember the Epicureans were virtue ethicists. They weren't saying, enjoy everything as much as you can, get as drunk and screw as much as you can, do as much drugs as you can. They weren't saying that. They were saying, well, you got to be temperate with that. Virtue will restore your enjoyment. So he says, encouraged by your joyous presence, I shall again renew the feast, with which from too much enjoyment my senses were well nigh sated, while the mind kept not pace with the body, nor afforded relief to her overburdened partner. So what is this going to look like? He says, if we want to understand this, we're going to find true wisdom not in the formal reasonings of the schools, not what philosophers have to tell us, but in cheerful discourses, experiential things. Hey, do you like this? Hey, try this out. Ooh, isn't this pleasant? This wine has notes of oak. That sort of business. Try these crackers with this cheese. And he says, in our friendly endearments, better in the hollow debates of statesmen and pretended patriots, does true virtue display itself. So this is, again, from the sort of Epicurean point of view. Forgetful of the past, secure of the future, let us enjoy the present, and let us fix some good beyond the power of fate and fortune. Tomorrow will bring its own pleasures along with it. Or, if tomorrow isn't good, we shall at least enjoy the pleasure of reflecting on the pleasures of today, which, by the way, was an Epicurean practice, to remember past pleasures, to call them back to mind. So it's setting out a certain way of life. And here he's going to talk about, this is sort of a measured thing. It's marked by peace, harmony, and concord reigning in this retreat, right? So it's not about, he mentions Bacchus, this god of wine and intoxication, revelry, and excess. You don't want excess, you just want to enjoy things. And he also talks about not letting glory seduce you. Social status, fame, celebrity, right? With their delusive blaze, right? He says, wisdom points out to you the road to pleasure. You can just enjoy yourself. You don't even have to be bothered by the fear of death. He says, you fear not that even death itself shall ravish pleasure from you. While you're still alive, calumny bereaves you of it, ignorance neglects it, nature enjoys it not, fancy alone. Don't have those things. Instead, enjoy yourself. And then he's got another very interesting set of reflections here. He talks about darkness coming. And he says, darkness stealing silently upon us has now buried all nature in a universal shade. What do you do now? Rejoice, my friends, continue your repast, or change it for soft repose. Though absent, your joy or tranquility shall still be mine. And notice he's going to bring up some sort of metaphysical questions. Whither do you go? What new pleasures call you from our society? Is there anything agreeable without your friends? And he says, yes, there is. The joy which I now seek admits not of your participation. Here alone I wish your absence. I can enjoy just on my own. And then he talks about enjoying it with somebody who he names Calia, the charming Calia, the mistress of my wishes, who wanders impatient through the grove and, preventing the appointed hour, silently chides my tardy steps. But the joy which she receives from my presence best pleads my excuse. right? With what words, my fair one, shall I express my tenderness or describe the emotions which now warm my bosom? Words are too faint to describe my love. So he's talking about a romantic relationship with this woman, Celia, who winds up expressing herself with sighs and tears, and he says, why distract your heart with such vain anxieties? Why ask me how long my love will endure? And he says, I don't know. I don't know how long my life is going to endure. But does this also disturb you? Is the image of our frail mortality forever present with you to throw a damp on your gayest hour? He says, no, consider this. If our life is short and transitory, enjoy the present moment and lose no part of so perishable an existence. Yet a little moment, and these shall be no more. We shall be as if we had never been. Not a memory of us will be left on earth, and even the fabulous shades below will not afford us a habitation. And then he notes, so all the things you're worried about right now, those are going to be gone too. Our fruitless anxieties, our vain projects, our uncertain speculations, our present doubts. And he says, this alone we may be certain of. If there any governing mind preside, he must be pleased to see us fulfill the ends of our being and enjoy that pleasure for which alone we were created. Right? So we should enjoy ourselves while we can, while we actually have some youth, and perhaps we can extend that further after our youth is over into other pleasures. We don't need to worry about the end of our life. We can enjoy even this perishable existence, as he's going to call it, right? And then he concludes by saying, while youth and passion prompt our eager desires, we must find gayer subjects of discourse to intermix with these amorous caresses, which gives you a clear idea that this is indeed a romantic involvement. So what he's sketched here is a way of living that is essentially centered around having as much pleasure as we can over the long term, which does require some virtue, some wisdom, some prudence, some prioritization of things so as not to fall into excess, but also keeping the things that tend to bother people, to interfere with their pleasure, at bay by using some useful reflections. And so Hume is calling this the stance of the Epicurean.